Okay, ready to go? Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Casey Sherman. I'm a New York Times best-selling author of 20 books, including my latest, Blood in the Water. And I call myself the accidental author. I never believed I'd be writing books one day, but that is until I was thrust into the spotlight because of my work on one case, one of the biggest cases in the history of American crime, the case of the Boston Strangler. Now, for me, that was a personal story because you see, my aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and final victim of that notorious 1960s murder spree. And questions about the guilt or innocence of the alleged killer led me to journalism school at Boston University and led me to where I am today. As I mentioned, I write a lot of true crime. Many of my books have been adapted to the big screen. I wrote Patriots Day, which was the chronicle of the Boston Marathon bombings that later became the film Patriots Day with Mark Wahlberg. I also wrote a book called The Finest Hours, which is a departure from true crime. It's a story about a Coast Guard rescue off Cape Cod in 1952 that was turned into a big major budget film for Walt Disney Studios, starring Chris Pine and Casey Affleck. And I've always been fascinated by the Coast Guard because of my background with that particular story. I've written a number of different books. Some of them take place here in Los Angeles. Many of them take place back in New England. Last year, I was here talking about a book that I wrote called A Murder in Hollywood. And that was a re-examination of the Lana Turner case from 1958. For those that might remember, Lana Turner was basically Marilyn Monroe before Marilyn. And she was caught in the biggest murder scandal pre-O.J. Simpson in Hollywood history. And when I re-examined that case, I found out that history got the story wrong. That Lana Turner wasn't the femme fatale that I had been reading about for 25, 30 years. She wasn't a villain in her own story. Instead, she was a feminist icon, and she was a hero. And she was put into a situation where she had to defend her family and defend herself. That book became a USA Today bestseller, and it sparked my first visit here to Zibby's. And we had a great event that night. And I said, next year, because I do write a book a year, I'll come back. And I was working on this story at the time called Blood in the Water. I have a lot of history here in Santa Monica. I wrote a book called Hunting Whitey, which was the fugitive capture of Boston crime boss James Whitey Bulger, which happened right here in Santa Monica. It's a crazy story. And so I'm always drawn back to this area and to this neighborhood. So Blood in the Water is a story about greed. It's a story about power. It's a story about murder. Back in 2016, a young man named Nathan Carmen, who was on the autism spectrum, took his mother, Linda, out on a deep-sea fishing trip off the coast of Rhode Island. And during that trip, their boat, a 31-foot aluminum vessel, went down in the ocean. The mom disappears. Nathan, the young man, is a survivor and a castaway on a life raft for up to 8 days when he is miraculously rescued by the crew of a passing Chinese cargo ship. I remember when the story broke, it was national news, and I was watching ABC World News Tonight that evening with David Muir, an old friend of mine from Boston. And because there were no images of the rescue that they could show on television, they showed clips of the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. So already there was a dramatization of this story that may or may not have been totally true. At first, it was considered a bittersweet story. This young man's amazing rescue and survival story, and what happened around the mystery regarding his mother. How did she go down with that boat? And when Nathan Carmen is brought to the U.S. Coast Guard station in Boston, because they've been looking for Nathan and his mother for 5 days, scouring an area of 54,000 square miles. It was one of the largest search and rescue missions in Coast Guard history, and they couldn't find any trace of Nathan, his mother, or their boat. So they gave up their search, and they were as surprised as anyone when the captain of that Chinese cargo ship radioed in and said, "We have somebody in a life raft, and his name is Nathan Carman, and he's been missing." So they're shocked, but they're also elated that this young man had survived. But then when they get him back to the Coast Guard station in Boston for a debriefing, an interview about what he had been doing for 7 days in the ordeal about being trapped 115 miles south of Martha's Vineyard in a life raft. I mean, it's a rescue story that, truth is always stranger than fiction. And this story certainly was at the time. But the Coast Guard rescuers, they begin to question Nathan's story, because Nathan claimed that his boat went down in an area called Block Canyon. And they use the word canyon specifically because it's the maritime equivalent of the Grand Canyon, meaning the fathoms and the depths in these ocean waters are hundreds of feet deep. And you don't go out into those waters unless you have a vessel that's at least 40 to 50 feet. And you don't go out into those waters until you have all modern equipment and a crew that can withstand 4 or 5 days fishing for large tuna in those those desolate waters. And here's Nathan in a tiny boat, and his only crew member is his mother, and they have 2 fishing poles. And the Coast Guard thinks that's odd, but then they say, well, if you went down in that general area, Nathan, why did your life raft drift in the opposite direction from where the currents would have taken you? And how, Nathan, do you look physically composed? If you've been in a life raft for 7 to 8 days, you would be hypothermic. You would be malnourished. You would lose all of your muscular condition. That didn't happen with Nathan. Once Nathan was rescued, he was able to get onto that Chinese cargo ship with barely any help. So they didn't believe he was telling the truth. Then they realize that he's also the prime suspect in the murder of his grandfather 3 years prior in Connecticut, all allegedly to gain access to a $50 million family fortune. Now, we're all, I'm sure, watching the Murdaugh case and have heard about that story in South Carolina. The family in this story makes the Murdaughs look like a bunch of amateurs. It truly does. And when I decided to jump into this case, because I've been monitoring this case for years and thinking, well, somebody's going to write this book. And because I had 5 books in queue, I didn't think I'd ever get to this story. But nobody wrote it. And eventually, Nathan is indicted for his mother's murder. And it's called Murder on the High Seas. That is the indictment. And I thought, okay, I'm going to cover Nathan's criminal trial. Now, I, as an investigative journalist, have covered 200 plus homicides. I've seen it all. And obviously, there are questions about this case. And I thought, as an investigative journalist, this would be a layup for me. I would attend the trial. I would sit, watching the defense and the prosecution battle it out with the witnesses. And I would get all the transcriptions and get some interviews outside court. And I'd have a book, regardless of whether or not he was acquitted or convicted. Then Nathan dies very mysteriously before his trial. Prosecutors claimed it was a suicide, but we don't know if it was. There are definitely Jeffrey Epstein-esque elements to this story. And if that is the case, if he didn't take his own life, who did? And who had the motive to kill? Now, when I began this journey, I thought, all right, there's a clear line between the allegations against Nathan Carman and his guilt. Everything I've read points to this. All the news specials that I've watched point to this. But because I didn't have the benefit of that trial to watch, passively observing what was happening, I had to put on my investigative journalism hat. And I had to gumshoe this case. And I'm so glad I did, because I interviewed well over 40 witnesses, both on and off the record. And the story I found is much different than the story that the media has led us all to believe. In fact, Nathan Carman may be innocent. Nathan Carmen was on the autism spectrum. When this story broke, his condition was referred to in the media and in popular culture as Asperger's syndrome. We don't call it Asperger's anymore. Turns out Dr. Asperger was a Nazi. So we have to now refer to it as autism spectrum disorder. But I'm mentioning that to you because this is how Nathan saw the world. He could not establish relationships with really anybody. And the only two people that he loved are the two people that he was later accused of murdering. So let's go back to that first murder, the grandfather, 87-year-old John Chaklis. John Chaklis is a self-made man. John Chaklis has built his wealth by constructing and designing assisted living facilities throughout New England. And he's a pillar in his community. He donates funds for every needy charity, whether it's the food bank or the local fire station that needs a new engine. John Chaklis is always there to give, and he is a beloved figure in his community. But John has a dark side. Very, very dark. John, at 87 years old, is watching his wife Rita die of breast cancer. And it's a very tragic story to watch from the outside. This beautiful love affair that lasted over 40 years is now ending. But what the public doesn't know is that John's got a 25-year-old mistress that he's been showering with money and sexual equipment for over a year. John is dark. John's also been involved with a lot of shady business dealings where he is certainly not paid his debts in many ways. John is also very Shakespearean. When I looked at this story and I began to write it, I thought, I've read this story before. It's King Lear. John Chaklis is the King Lear figure in this entire story because he had four daughters that fought for his love, that fought for his attention, that fought for his money. And John always played the puppet master, pitting the daughters against each other, shutting them off emotionally, shutting them off financially. John, as a patriarch of a Greek family, really disregarded his adult daughters, didn't respect them, but he loved his first male grandchild, and that was Nathan Carmen. John overlooked Nathan's disorder. John, in fact, was going to give Nathan Carmen the entire family business, a $50 million family business to take care of. So why would Nathan Carmen have any motivation to kill his grandfather if he was going to reap the rewards of all of that success within a few years' time anyways? But the police in this very small town in Windsor, Connecticut, identify Nathan as the prime suspect in the murder right away. And the reason for that is because the daughters, Nathan's aunts, all pinned the guilty finger on their nephew. Nathan killed Dad. So this is all that police had to go on. And so they put Nathan in the chair and they interview Nathan over a period of hours. And Nathan, who's got, autism, is not necessarily responding to the questions that he is being asked because there's no expert in autism spectrum disorder who was in that room. These are small town detectives treating Nathan like they would treat me off the street and grilling me and asking me questions about the murder of my grandfather. Now, Nathan was the last person that ever saw John Chaklis alive. They had dinner the night that John was killed. But after Nathan said goodbye to his grandfather, John had 3 phone calls. One was from Linda, Nathan's mother. The other one was from his 25-year-old mistress. And then the last call was from the caretaker of John's very elaborate Kennedy-esque mansion in southern New Hampshire. Because John, again, the pillar of his community, had a holiday lighting display where he put up 6 million Christmas lights and then charged people to come watch the display. And all that money went to charitable endeavors. John on the outside. John on the inside, very dark. At 2 a.m. the next morning, the next door neighbor, a young woman, is sleeping in a bedroom basically adjacent to where John Chaklis slept in his home. and she hears three loud bangs. She doesn't know what it is. It's a quiet cul-de-sac. She doesn't know what a gunshot sounds like. It could be a car backfiring because immediately she heard the squealing of tires. The next morning, one of John's adult daughters visited her father to make sure that he was taking his heart medication because John was a worker. John got up at 4:30 every morning and he was at his desk building and growing his empire. And she goes into the home and she doesn't smell coffee brewing. She doesn't hear the ruffling of papers in John's desk. So she walks into the bedroom and she sees her father dead in his bed, the victim of three rifle blasts, two through the torso and one, the kill shot that blew out the back of John's skull. Police are called. They descend on the home and they're trying to figure out who could have murdered this retired 87-year-old man so violently in his bed. Now, John was a combat veteran from World War II. He had survived the jungles of the Philippines. And here he is in the twilight of his life, and he's murdered where he slept. So they have no idea who to find and question first. However, his daughters do. Nathan's aunts focus on Nathan, bring him in, question him. And police do. And police are curious, and they believe that John Chaklis has been murdered with a Sig Sauer rifle because they think some of the ballistics may add up to that particular weapon. And they ask Nathan Carman, Nathan, do you own a Sig Sauer rifle? And Nathan looks directly at them and says, no, I do not. And that becomes a big issue in this case because Nathan did own a Sig Sauer rifle that has never been recovered. Now, one of the questions that I had, given Nathan's condition and how Nathan answered prompts, that detective never asked, did you own a Sig Sauer rifle? Because Nathan had no filter. Nathan probably would have said, yes, I did. Not do you own a Sig Sauer rifle, because Nathan didn't own it. And one thing that prosecutors or detectives in Connecticut also overlooked was at 2 a.m. in the morning, when that only witness hears three blasts coming from John Chaklis's bedroom, Nathan is captured on surveillance video 14 miles away at a Stop and Shop buying ice cream because Nathan used to like to play online chess. So how could one person be in one spot and kill his grandfather 14 miles away? It doesn't make sense, which is why Connecticut State Police never charged Nathan with his grandfather's murder. But Nathan was vilified in the press. He was vilified by his aunts. So Nathan takes a very small portion of his inheritance and he moves to Vermont. Very quiet, rural life that Nathan wanted to live. And he wanted to build upon his inheritance by owning or buying dilapidated historic farmhouses and remodeling them, and then, flipping them and, selling them for double what they were worth. There's a problem with that. Nathan wasn't a carpenter. Nathan watched YouTube videos. That's how Nathan learned how to, build and tear down things. Now, I've been to that home in Vermont, and I don't know if you've ever played Jenga with your children or your families. The home looks like a pile of Jenga blocks ready to collapse on itself. And I thought, wow, that is a perfect visual in my mind into Nathan's mind. This is how this young man thinks. He thinks that he can take things apart and then try to put them back together when he really has no skill set to do so. So while he is trying to become this carpenter in training, Nathan is also an avid fisherman. And Nathan buys a 31-foot boat. But Nathan's got no friends. And the only person willing to go fishing with him is his mother, 54-year-old Linda Carman. The problem child, John Chaklis's wayward daughter, who spent many years living here in Southern California because she had to get away from her father because they were alike and they butted heads consistently. The one thing they fought over more vehemently than any other topic was Nathan's care. Linda Carman wanted Nathan institutionalized. Linda Carman wanted to keep her son in bubble wrap because her son could not communicate with others. John Chocolates didn't want that for Nathan. John Chocolates overlooked his disorder. John Chocolates was ready to give him everything. So the conflict between father and daughter spills into violence. While Nathan is at a psychiatric facility in Hartford, Connecticut, and father and daughter are fist fighting over Nathan's care, and Linda Carmen gets arrested for elder abuse. Ultimately, those charges were dropped. But I just wanted to show you the volatile nature of this family. And it all goes back to John Chocolates and how he raised his daughters to be vipers, if you will, pitting them against each other for his love, his affection, and his fortune. So when Nathan buys this 31-foot aluminum boat, Nathan is not an experienced fisherman, not at all. But Nathan wants to go out deep sea fishing. So he takes his mother out several years after the murder of his grandfather. And now it's September 2016, 3 years after John Chocolates has been murdered in Connecticut. And it's a beautiful stretch of weather. And Nathan feels like he can go out with his mother overnight, fish, and then bring her back. That doesn't happen. They go out, two people go out, one person comes back. And immediately, once the Coast Guard and the media pick up the scent of this story, again, they re-villainize Nathan Carmen. Nathan is the killer. Now, there is a reason why that boat went down. It's because, and remember, Nathan was that inexperienced carpenter that almost collapsed his own home. Nathan made his own repairs to his aluminum boat. Nathan basically drilled out what they call trim tabs. Anybody that knows boating understands that trim tabs almost help balance a vessel. But Nathan thought the trim tabs were dragging his little boat, and he wanted to make the boat go faster. Now, if you're plotting to kill your mother, and this is how you're going to do it, and if you're drilling those holes, if I was going to do it, I might take that boat out of the water, put it in dry dock, make those repairs under the cover of darkness so that nobody can see me. Nathan doesn't do that. Nathan makes those repairs at the marina in Rhode Island in front of maybe 15 to 30 witnesses. And one of the witnesses that I interviewed told me, he said, Casey, I knew Nathan didn't know how to repair his boat because he was trying to cover those holes with an epoxy. And he goes, have you ever seen a kid blow a big bubble of bubble gum and then it pops in his face? He goes, that's what Nathan looked like. Nathan had the epoxy all over himself and very little went into filling those holes. Now, Nathan probably didn't notice this, but took that boat out and the boat went down. Now, despite the suspicion around Nathan, this is still a no-body murder. We don't know where Linda Carmen is. In fact, Linda wasn't declared dead for 7 years. So Nathan is not tried or charged with a murder up to that point. Now, if you're a killer and you've just gotten away with the perfect crime, if it was me, and again, I've covered 200 homicides, I know murderers and how they think, I might blend back into anonymity and not, put the spotlight on myself. Nathan doesn't do that. Nathan sues his insurance company because the insurance company won't pay out for the boat accident. And we're only talking about $85,000. And Nathan's willing to go to trial to defend himself on this, and he does. Meanwhile, he's also dealing with a legal case in New Hampshire where his grandfather had built this opulent fortune because his aunts are suing him under what is called a Slayer petition. They believe or claim that Nathan murdered their father, and they wanted him civilly held responsible for the murder so he would not gain any access to the family fortune. So Nathan is fighting a legal battle on two fronts. And remember Nathan, the amateur carpenter, Nathan, the amateur boat builder. Now you see Nathan, the amateur lawyer. Nathan's got to defend himself in court in New Hampshire. And he does, and he's actually really good. I'll say I've watched the deposition and I'm like, God, this kid, there's something there. He knows what he's doing. Maybe he doesn't. But when he does go on trial in Rhode Island, the FBI is sitting in the gallery along with the Coast Guard investigators because they think he's a killer. He's a double killer. And they're watching witness after witness come out and talk about, well, Nathan was drifting in the wrong direction from where he was and the boat goes down. So they feel like, okay, we're allowing, this insurance company lawyer to build our criminal case for us. And Nathan is eventually found responsible for the boat mishap, not criminally responsible, but negligent for what had happened. But the Coast Guard and the FBI think he's a killer. So they begin to reevaluate the murder charges against him, and they begin to shop the case around. They go to Connecticut, where Granddad is long dead, and they ask the U.S. attorney there, "Will you finally try and indict Nathan Carman for murder?" And the U.S. attorney says, "No, there's not enough evidence against Nathan Carman to do so." Then they go to Rhode Island, where that boat had gone. And the U.S. attorney says, "I'm not touching this case. There's not enough evidence to try Nathan Carman." So then they go to Vermont, where Nathan is living in that dilapidated farmhouse. And they approach the newly anointed U.S. attorney, who's looking for a big case to make his mark in the legal community. And they convince him that because Nathan lived in Vermont and was buying his fishing equipment online, you've got jurisdiction. You can now charge him with murder. And he is charged with murder on the high seas. And in this book, you will read word for word that indictment. It's the most shocking indictment I've ever read, because not only are they indicting Nathan for murdering Linda Carman, but they accuse him of killing his grandfather. They weave in the John Chocolus murder, possibly polluting any future juror to look at this case objectively. So Nathan had a very strong defense just based on those grounds alone. And as I mentioned, I interviewed dozens of witnesses in this case. Some people I wanted to interview for hours. Other people I only wanted to interview for 5 minutes. Give me some flavor. And one of the people I approached was the caretaker of the John Chocolus estate in New Hampshire. What was it like to be on a fly in the wall to watch how this dysfunctional, sometimes violent family interacted with each other? Now, I grew up on Cape Cod. I grew up a mile and a half away from the Kennedy compound. Now, I'm Irish, but they refer to my family, the Sullivans, as shanty Irish. The Kennedys were lace curtain Irish. So my family worked at the compound, and we saw all the shenanigans that went on there. And that's what I was looking for, from the caretaker. And it was a Sunday in November, and I remember reaching out to her, and she said, "I won't talk to you on the phone. You have to come up and meet me." And now picture this, the snow's falling. My favorite team, the New England Patriots, are about to play at 1 o'clock. I've got chili steaming in the crock pot. My day is set, but I got to go. I got to follow the evidence where it takes me. And when I do interview her, it lasts hours. And she's very revealing and also very honest and very truthful. And she's told me a story that shook me to my core. She said 2 weeks before John Chocolus was murdered in his bed, the caretaker, a female named Joy Washburn, was approached by someone connected to the Chocolus family. And that person asked Joy, "Joy, do you like to hunt?" Joy lived in a rural area of New Hampshire. Of course, she grew up hunting. And Joy said, "Yeah, I hunt every weekend." "Well, can you take John Chocolus out into the woods? Can you shoot him? And can you make it look like a hunting accident? And we'll pay you $10,000. Now, Joy, hearing this, thinks it's a bad joke. Somebody with a macabre sense of humor. Until 2 weeks later, John Chocolus is murdered in his bed. Now, when I got that story from Joy, it could have just been a disgruntled former employee casting dispersions against mysterious people. But I vetted that story through the FBI. And the FBI agents and the Coast Guard investigators said, no, Joy Washburn was incredibly credible. Therefore, her story elevated to what is called a 302 report in the FBI, which meant Joy Washburn would have been the first defense witness called in Nathan's trial. You want to talk reasonable doubt? Nathan would have been acquitted, in my opinion, in this case. Whether or not he's guilty or innocent, he would have been acquitted in a court of law. And when I began to interview the Coast Guard investigators who did their job diligently and the FBI, I had my own questions. I said, okay, I'm going to follow your theory here. So you say that Nathan murdered his mother at sea, but you looked for him for 5 days and you covered 64,000 square miles and you couldn't find a trace of him. Where was he? If you're going to plan the perfect murder, you need to plan the perfect getaway. And no one could explain Nathan's whereabouts. Some person mentioned, well, he may have gone to shore for 5 days and hid somewhere on his boat, and then eventually went back out 115 miles south of Martha's Vineyard, sunk the boat, and got into that life raft. I said, oh, geez, that is real planning here. And Nathan might be the criminal mastermind that you're talking about. But I said, if I'm following your thread, that means Nathan is also monitoring the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. It was almost impossible that Nathan was rescued by the crew of a passing Chinese cargo ship, a freighter. You know, they barely saw him, let alone rescue him. So that is taking a very big gamble that all of this is going to pay off for you. So therefore, I said, if you can't explain that to me, the prosecutor would never be able to explain that to the jury. And then I interviewed the FBI lead agent on the case. And I said, bringing up Nathan's disorder, his autism spectrum disorder. And I said, did you ever consult anybody who is an expert in this field? Because I have. It's part of my job. I have to do that as I'm writing the book. And the FBI agent said, no, we had our own profilers profile Nathan. We just led, we took the evidence and led it where it needed to go. But we were getting to it. We were going to interview somebody or question somebody that had that expertise and that may have then consulted and done their own profile of Nathan Carman. And I said, you were getting to it. You had 4 years to get to it. Nathan's dead. You ran out of time. So in writing this book, I throw all of my fastballs straight down the middle as an investigative journalist. Here, I give you the prosecution's case. Here, I give you the defense. And I put all of you in the jury box. And when you read it, I want to ask you, what do you think happened? Do you think Nathan is a villain or a victim in his own story? And, one of the magical things about the internet is that all of the online reviews are populating almost on a daily basis. And I read them all. And I'm very curious about it because my readers are split. Some of my readers think he's a criminal mastermind. Other readers think he was targeted because of his affliction. And if you ask me, what do you think, Casey Sherman? I said, it depends on the day. Some days I wake up and I think, this guy was a genius, a criminal genius. And other days I wake up and I think there's no way he could have pulled it off. So if I was in that jury box, however, I would have voted to acquit. So when you read this story, you're going to see layers of complexity, layers of family dynamics that are wrapped around the hunger for wealth and the hunger for power. And ultimately, it leads to the very tragic endings of not just one person, but two. John Chocolass was murdered. Linda Carman either was killed by Nathan on that boat or she drowned. But recently, she was declared deceased after 7 years. But what the media didn't understand for a long time, and part of the motivations that the media and some of the investigators said was in Nathan's mind when he allegedly murdered his mother, is that he wanted to get her inheritance as well. But Linda took him out of her will. Nathan was going to gain nothing from the murder of his mother.
Did he know that?
That is a question that I can't answer because there are only 3 people who can answer that question. The only 3 people that really know what truly happened, they're all dead. So I stack the Jenga blocks for you. Just take it one piece at a time and let the evidence lead you to where you need to go. And that is the story of Blood in the Water. Thank you very much.
Crazy. Did they ever find the body?
They never found Linda Carmen's body. And for a while, there was even suspicion in a conspiracy theory that Linda Carmen murdered her father, because Linda Carmen also knew her way around weapons. Linda Carmen had a violent relationship with him. They fought. Linda was arrested for abusing her father. So, Linda's role in this whole case is a bit nebulous.
Did Nathan ever offer an answer about what happened to his mother?
Nathan did. In fact, after being persecuted by the press, Nathan called a correspondent for ABC's 2020. And Nathan sat down in his only interview. So when my book came out in April 2020, did a 90-minute special on the book, and using footage of Nathan talking about his mother, denying any role in his mother's murder. He said it was an accident, that the boat went down before he could even figure out what was happening. Meanwhile, Nathan had the life raft ready to go. And some of the prosecutors would say Nathan had 3 chances to ignite his EPIRB, his emergency beacon, if he knew that boat was going down, but he walked past that EPIRB 3 times. Suspicious. But I've also talked to autism spectrum experts who say Nathan would have been task oriented, meaning Nathan, in his mind, get that lifeboat ready. Don't worry about anything else. Get that lifeboat ready and then get your mother onto that life raft. And when he looked, allegedly, behind him, she was gone. And then the boat sank. But the mystery endures.
He's still super high functioning, though.
Well, when you read the book, he's bright, but he, again, this is where the disorder plays in. And every, one odd person with autism is not like another person with autism, just like anything else, compulsive disorder, any disorder we all have, and I think that Nathan, when you read Nathan in this book, I hope you'll have a little empathy for him. If you don't, and if you think he's a cold-blooded killer, well, that's up to you. As I said, I go back and forth on it. But he was highly functioning. However, he was brilliant in certain areas and absolutely dysfunctional in others.
I think the sisters did it. One of them did it.
I'm not going to go there at all.
No idea,
But I would say that you have to look at motivation. Who had motivation to murder John Chocolus? I can't speak to that. Maybe at some point in the distant or recent future, the real story might come to fruition. Meaning, John Chocolus's killer might reveal him or herself on their deathbed. You never know.
Yeah.
But I think that these deadly secrets are buried, both in the earth in Connecticut and in the fathoms of Block Island in the extenuating ocean.
Yeah.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Sorry. So maybe I'm just a little naive, but he committed suicide?
That is the question, and that's how I started this talk. Nathan died mysteriously in prison. The warden claimed that he committed suicide, and he left a suicide note behind. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a note for his lawyers to follow up on an investigative lead the next day. I spent a lot of time interviewing Nathan's father, Clark Carmen, and Clark told me, he said, Casey, the walls weren't closing in on my son. Meaning, if anybody was conditioned to survive prison, it was Nathan Carmen, because he loved structure. He wasn't materialistic. He loved to wake up in the same bed, get 3 meals a day, and then go to the prison library and study up on his case. So, the idea that he would suddenly just kill himself a few months before he was going to go on trial and most likely be acquitted doesn't make much sense. And when you read the book, there is a shocking part of the story at the end, but I'll reveal it because we're having this discussion. When Nathan dies, his body is immediately cremated, and I'm still trying to figure out who ordered that because I have a lot of experience in forensic science. My aunt was the last victim of the Boston Strangler case. So I had to exhume her remains for DNA testing and exhume the remains of the alleged Boston Strangler and match and compare what was found. And there was no trace evidence of that man on her remains. Somebody else killed her. But we didn't have that opportunity with Nathan because he would scream at it. So Clark Carmen told me, he said, I got a call from a family member right after Nathan's death. And they asked for Nathan's remains. They wanted them. These are the same people that accused him of murder. And they wanted to bury Nathan right next to his grandfather. And Clark Carmen said, you're out of your minds. I would never do that. But then Clark said, I had to rethink that because Clark is convinced Nathan never murdered his grandfather. Clark is convinced that the only person Nathan truly loved in life was John Chaklis. So therefore, why shouldn't he be buried next to the one person he loved for eternity? And that's where they are today.
How old was he?
What's that?
How old was he?
How old was Nathan? He was in his late 20s. It's tragic. And I attended the funeral. And I remember, regardless of whether you think he's a killer or he's completely innocent, it was still very sad because the only people that attended the funeral were his lawyers and their staffers, and me and a couple of other reporters / journalists. And Nathan's defense attorney got up and gave the eulogy, the most bizarre eulogy I've ever seen, because it was the opening statement that the lawyer was going to use at trial. That was his eulogy. And he, railed against Nathan's aunts and Nathan's family for not showing up at the church. But they were there. We didn't know it because we were all facing the front of the church. The surviving aunts were in the church. And the question I have today is, were they there to pay respects to their nephew, or were they there to make sure he was dead?
Spooky.
Yeah. So we're now adapting Blood in the Water into a feature film with Appian Way, Leo DiCaprio's company. And I'm working with a screenwriter to figure out some of these very nuanced, layers and themes. It's almost reminiscent of a film that came out 20 plus years ago with a young Ed Norton called Primal Fear, where Ed Norton was someone who was on the spectrum. And for the entire movie, you don't know if he's, grappling with his disorder or if he's playing us. And, we're going to take that similar theme here because, only Nathan knows what truly transpired.
That's amazing. Well, I want to watch it.
Me too. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you.